The gavel came down like a gunshot, and Aaron Bailey felt the world crack open beneath his boots. Property of the Duskwater Valley, comprising 412 acres of grazing land, the Bailey Ranch House and all outbuildings thereon, is hereby declared forfeit to the Territorial Land Commission, effective immediately. Deputy Marshal Clyde Hurst read the words from a folded document with the slow, deliberate satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a very long time to say them. He stood at the front of the Redemption Creek Town Hall, a squat limestone building that smelled of candle wax and old grievances, and he let every syllable fall with the weight of a headstone. Aaron stood in the center of the room with his hat in his hands and dust on his coat, and 3 years of backbreaking work written into every line of his face. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark eyes that had seen drought and flood, and the particular loneliness that comes from building something beautiful in the middle of nowhere. He had poured everything he owned and everything he was into that ranch, and now Hurst was standing there with a piece of paper telling him it was over. The room was packed. Ranchers, merchants, saloon keepers, and curious townspeople lined the walls 3 deep, and Aaron could feel their sympathy pressing against him like heat. Even sympathy felt like a kind of pity, and he had always hated pity. He had known this was coming. The debt had been called in by the Consolidated Territorial Land Company, a shadow organization with offices in Santa Fe and fingers in every deed registry from El Paso to Colorado. They had bought his loan from the original lender 6 months ago, buried a fraudulent clause deep in the transfer paperwork, and then waited for him to miss a payment he had never technically been required to make. It was a trap, clean and elegant and perfectly legal on its surface, and Aaron had walked straight into it. Hurst unfolded a second paper. The Consolidated Territorial Land Company hereby assumes title and intends to subdivide the valley for stop. The voice came from the back of the room. It was a woman's voice, clear and steady as a surveyor's plumb line, and it cut through the murmur of the crowd so cleanly that every head turned at once. She was standing near the doorway, and Aaron had not noticed her come in. She was tall for a woman, dark-haired, wearing a fitted riding jacket the color of pine bark over a cream blouse, with a leather satchel strapped across one shoulder that looked like it had traveled many miles. She was perhaps 28, with sharp green eyes that were already scanning the front of the room with a kind of focused intelligence that Aaron had never quite seen on a person's face before. It was the look of someone who had already calculated the outcome and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She walked forward through the parting crowd without hurrying, reached into her satchel, and placed a document on the table in front of Hurst with a firmness that made the deputy take an involuntary step back. "My name is Delia Maddox," she said. "I am a licensed land agent, registered with the New Mexico Territorial Land Office, authorized number 317. That document you are holding is fraudulent. And this," she tapped the sealed envelope on the table, "is the deed that proves it." Hurst stared at her. The room stared at her. Aaron Bailey stared at her, and the gavel that had come down like a judgment began impossibly to rise. 3 weeks earlier, Aaron Bailey had no idea that Delia Maddox existed. He had spent that particular morning the way he spent most mornings, which was up before the sun and already arguing with the world. The argument that morning was with a section of fence line along the north pasture that the autumn floods had knocked sideways, and with 2 of his ranch hands, Miguel and Pete, who were doing their level best to help and not quite managing it. Aaron was not an unkind employer, but he was demanding, and when the fence refused to cooperate, he pulled off his gloves and took over himself, driving the posts with a methodical, powerful rhythm that left his hands raw and his mind temporarily quiet. The Bailey Ranch sat in Duskwater Valley, which was a stretch of high desert grassland in the territory of New Mexico, framed on the west by red sandstone mesas, and on the east by the distant blue suggestion of mountains. It was 1882, and the railroad had come through the territory 2 years prior, which meant the land had suddenly become worth a great deal more than it had been when Aaron's father had filed the original deed in 1864. That was the heart of the problem. The land had always been Aaron's family's, settled by his father, James Bailey, who had come out of Tennessee with nothing but a mule and a stubborn conviction that the land could be made to produce something beautiful if you were patient enough with it. James had been patient. Aaron had inherited that patience along with the land when his father died of pneumonia 3 winters ago, leaving Aaron the ranch, the debts, and the specific grief of a man who has lost his only family. The Consolidated Territorial Land Company had started its operations in the territory about 18 months back. Aaron had heard the name the way you hear a distant thunderstorm, as something on the horizon that might or might not be coming your way. He had heard stories about other ranchers, families with homestead rights that went back 20 years, waking up one morning to find a deputy on their porch with a foreclosure notice. He had heard those stories and told himself his situation was different, that his paperwork was clean and his debts were manageable, and that he had done nothing wrong. That had been his first mistake. The thing about the Consolidated Territorial Land Company was that you did not need to have done anything wrong for them to ruin you. You just needed to be standing on land they wanted. The man behind the company in Redemption Creek was a man named Garrett Fitch, and he operated out of a suite of offices above the Redemption Creek National Bank, which he also effectively controlled. Fitch was 53 years old, impeccably dressed, and had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had come to the territory from back east with capital behind him and connections to the territorial government that ran deeper than most people knew or wanted to investigate. He was not the sort of villain who drew guns or made threats in saloons. He was the sort who filed documents and waited, and that made him considerably more dangerous. Aaron had met Fitch exactly once, at a town meeting about water rights 6 months before the foreclosure proceedings began. Fitch had been charming and reasonable and entirely without the quality of honesty, and Aaron had come away from that meeting with a cold feeling in his chest that he had not been able to shake since. He was still thinking about Fitch when Pete called out from the gate. "Rider coming up from the South Road, boss." Aaron set down his tools and shaded his eyes. The rider was moving at a working trot, not the urgent gallop of someone bringing bad news, but there was something purposeful about the pace that caught his attention. As the figure came closer, he could see it was a woman, alone, riding a dark bay horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent significant time in the saddle. She sat straight-backed but relaxed, and she was leading a pack mule with several large leather cases lashed to its sides. She pulled up at the gate and looked at Aaron with those green eyes, direct and measuring, without any of the social performance that most people put on when they arrived somewhere new. "Aaron Bailey," she said. "That is me," he said. "Delia Maddox. I have been hired by the Territorial Land Office to conduct a survey and deed audit of the Duskwater Valley properties. Yours is on the list." She reached into her jacket and produced a folded paper with an official seal. "I will need access to any original deed documents you have, your survey markers, and approximately 3 days of your time, or the time of someone who can show me the boundary lines." Aaron looked at the paper. The seal was real. He had seen official territorial documents enough times to recognize the difference between authentic government work and something run up to look like it. "What kind of audit?" he asked. "The kind that determines whether the deeds currently being used to transfer property in this valley are accurate representations of the original grants," she said. "There have been irregularities in the territorial records. I have been tasked with finding them." Aaron felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly. Something more guarded than hope, but in the same general neighborhood. "You had better come in," he said. He found out over the following hours that Delia Maddox was not simply a land agent in the bureaucratic sense. She was a surveyor, specifically trained, with a degree from the Missouri School of Science that she had completed in 1877, as one of only 3 women in her program. She had spent the subsequent 5 years working for the Federal Land Office in Santa Fe, developing what her supervisor apparently called an uncanny ability to detect inconsistencies in survey records, fraudulent deed filings, and the kind of mathematical irregularities that most people missed, because they required both a thorough knowledge of land law and a facility with the kind of geometry that made most lawyers' eyes glaze over. She explained none of this to Aaron that first day. He learned it in pieces over the course of the 3 days she had promised him. What she did that first evening was spread an enormous hand-drawn map across the kitchen table, weigh the corners down with coffee cups and a spare horseshoe, and begin asking him questions with the systematic precision of a doctor conducting an examination. When was the original grant filed? What was the reference point used for the boundary survey? Had the survey markers ever been verified against the original Government Land Office baseline? Did he have the original filed plat or only the copied deed? Aaron answered every question as accurately as he could, which was more accurately than most men could have managed, because he had inherited his father's meticulous record-keeping along with the land. He produced a metal strongbox from under the floorboards of the bedroom, and inside it were documents going back to 1864, including the original grant paperwork with the government stamp, the filed plat with surveyor's signature, tax receipts, water rights filings, and a handful of letters from the land office that his father had saved with the careful instincts of a man who knew that paper was the only thing standing between you and someone who wanted what you had. Delia went through every document with both hands and a quiet intensity that Aaron found himself watching when he thought she was not looking. She had a particular way of holding a document, tilted slightly toward the light, her head at a precise angle, that reminded him of the way a piano tuner pressed his ear close to the strings. She was listening for the wrong note. She found several. On the second day, she rode with Aaron along the boundary lines, and this was where he began to understand what she was truly capable of. She carried a surveyor's transit, a precise optical instrument mounted on a wooden tripod, and she set it up at intervals with a practiced efficiency that would have impressed any trained surveyor. But more than the instrument, it was the way she read the land itself that caught Aaron off guard. She would crouch near a rock cairn or a carved tree bearing and spend 2 or 3 minutes in total stillness, her eyes moving between the terrain and the documents in her hand. And then she would write something down with the kind of quiet certainty that suggested she had found exactly what she was looking for. "This marker has been moved," she said on the second morning, crouching near a pile of flat stones at the northeast corner of the property. She pointed to a depression in the ground about 8 feet away. "That is where it was originally set. You can see the disturbance in the soil, and if you look at the drainage pattern, the water has been running around this rock pile for less than 2 years. It was moved after the flood of 1880. Aaron crouched beside her. He could see what she was pointing to, the subtle wrongness of the displaced earth, the faint outline of a former placement. He had walked past that cairn hundreds of times and never noticed. "Who moved it?" he asked. "That is what I intend to prove," she said. That evening they sat on the porch as the sun went down behind the mesas, turning the sky the color of embers, and Aaron found himself telling her things he had not said aloud to anyone. About his father, about the particular weight of inheriting a place someone else had loved before you, about the way the valley felt like a living thing that had been entrusted to him rather than simply owned by him. He was not a man who talked easily about feelings, and he was surprised by how naturally the words came when she listened the way she did, with her full attention, without the social interruptions that most people made when they were really just waiting for their turn to speak. She listened, and she asked the occasional question that cut to the center of something in a way that made him think, and when it was his turn to listen, she told him a little about herself, about growing up in St. Louis with a father who was a civil engineer and a mother who had died when she was 11, which meant that her education had come from following her father around construction sites and land offices and learning to read blueprints before she could properly read novels. About the Missouri school and the particular hostility of men who could not tolerate competence in a woman, which had not broken her but had sharpened her into something precise and self-sufficient. About taking the job with the Territorial Land Office because the work was real and necessary and nobody could pretend it was not. She did not tell him everything. He could feel the places where she held back, the same way you feel the depth of water you cannot quite see the bottom of. There was something about why this particular audit had been assigned to her, something personal in the way she approached the Consolidated Territorial Land Company's operations that she was keeping to herself. He noticed it and said nothing. He was not a man who pushed. On the third day, everything changed. Delia had spent most of the morning in Aaron's kitchen, with the documents spread across the table and her surveyor's notebook open beside them, doing the kind of mathematical work that Aaron watched without pretending to follow. She was calculating something with a ruler and a set of surveyor's tables, her pencil moving in quick, precise strokes, and periodically she would stop and check a figure against a page in the notebook and then continue. She had been at it for 3 hours when she put down the pencil and sat very still for a moment. "There it is," she said quietly. "What?" Aaron asked from across the room, where he had been pretending to read a newspaper for the past hour. The Consolidated Territorial Land Company filed a deed transfer for a property adjoining yours to the east 6 months ago. That transfer used a boundary description that overlaps with your northeast corner by approximately 14 acres. She turned the notebook so he could see the figures. They did not simply move your marker. They went into the Territorial Deed Registry in Santa Fe and filed an amended boundary description for the Harlow property, which is the land east of yours, using coordinates that had been deliberately miscalculated to push the property line 14 acres into your land. Aaron stared at the figures. He was not a mathematician, but he could follow the logic of what she had laid out, and the logic was damning. "Is that enough to stop the foreclosure?" he asked. Delia's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. There was something careful in her eyes that had not been there a moment ago. "The foreclosure is based on a separate mechanism," she said. "A clause in the debt transfer from the First Territorial Bank to the Consolidated Land Company, stating that full repayment was due within 30 days of the transfer, which was not in your original loan agreement. That is a legal matter, and it is separate from the survey fraud I have found." "Then what good does this do me?" Aaron asked. The question came out harder than he intended. "The survey fraud proves a pattern," she said carefully. "If I can document that the Consolidated Land Company has been systematically manipulating survey records across the valley, it gives the territorial government grounds to open a full investigation into all of their activities, including the debt transfer mechanism they used against you. It is not a guarantee, but it is the foundation of one." Aaron looked at her for a long moment. "You knew this going in," he said. "You knew the foreclosure was coming before you arrived here." She met his eyes steadily. "Yes. Who hired you for this audit, really?" A breath. "The audit is real and official, but I requested this specific assignment." A pause. "Garrett Fitch used the same debt transfer mechanism against my father's land company in Kansas in 1879. He bankrupted my father and walked away clean. My father died 8 months later. I have been building the case against Fitch and the Consolidated Land Company for 3 years. Her voice was level, but underneath the levelness was something Aaron recognized as grief that had been converted, through long discipline, into purpose. "I am going to destroy what he has built legally and completely, and then I am going to make certain that every person he has stolen from is made whole." Aaron was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father, that was his dark past that pushed you into this." "I prefer to think of it as my own reason," she said. He nodded slowly. He respected that distinction deeply. What followed over the next 2 weeks was the most intensive period of work Aaron had witnessed since the ranch's early days. Delia rode the valley from end to end. documenting survey irregularities on 8 separate properties. Cross-referencing each one against the original territorial grant records she had obtained from Santa Fe, building a mathematical case that Aaron could see growing in the pages of her notebook like a structure being assembled piece by careful piece. She was at it before he was up and still at it after he went to bed, and the lamp in the kitchen burned late into the night. He brought her coffee at midnight once and found her so absorbed in her calculations that she did not hear him come in until he set the cup near her elbow, at which point she startled, and then, in the moment of startlement, laughed at herself with a self-deprecating honesty that he found unexpectedly disarming. It was the first time he had seen her defenses slip, and the person underneath was warm in a way that surprised him, given the precision and self-containment of her usual manner. "You should sleep," he said. "I sleep when the case is complete," she said. "That is a dangerous habit." "Most of my habits are," she said, without looking up from her notebook. But there was a small smile at the corner of her mouth that he carried back to bed with him like a lantern. He was aware, in the careful, watchful way he had of being aware of things, that he was developing feelings for her that had no clear category in his experience. He had liked women before. He had been engaged once, briefly, to a girl from the town of Taos, but that had ended when it became clear they were fundamentally strangers who had confused proximity for connection. What he felt about Delia was different in a way he struggled to articulate. She was not a woman he felt tender toward, at least not in the protective, solicitous way he had felt toward the girl from Taos. She was a woman he admired, which was a stranger and more powerful thing, because admiration had a different quality of permanence. You could stop feeling tender, but admiration, once earned, tended to persist. He admired her intelligence. He admired her determination. He admired the particular way she held her ground in conversations with men who were accustomed to having the room to themselves, which she did without aggression and without apology, simply by being exactly as competent as she was and letting the competent speak. He had watched her in the town of Redemption Creek twice during the audit, at the county assessor's office, where she had extracted deed records from a clerk who had been clearly reluctant to produce them, and at a meeting with 2 other ranchers from the valley whose properties were part of her investigation. In both instances, she had been so clearly the most knowledgeable person in the room that resistance had folded like wet paper. But it was not a simple admiration without complication. He caught himself, late at night, thinking not just about her professional capabilities, but about the way she moved when she thought no one was watching. A kind of unguarded grace that was entirely separate from her controlled, purposeful manner when she was working. He thought about the evening on the porch when she had talked about her father with her eyes on the distant mountains, and her voice carefully modulated, and he had wanted very badly to reach over and put his hand over hers, and he had not, because he had felt the boundary she maintained around that grief as clearly as if it were a physical fence. He did not know what she felt about him, if she felt anything beyond the professional tolerance of a woman focused entirely on a mission that had nothing to do with him personally. He suspected she did not allow herself to feel things that would complicate the work, and he respected that even as it frustrated him. He told himself it did not matter and knew he was lying to himself, and felt, in his honest moments, that this was probably a reasonable place to be. The foreclosure hearing was scheduled for the 14th of October, 1882. 3 days before it, Delia came back from a trip to the county seat with a look on her face that Aaron had not seen before. It took him a moment to identify it, because it was not quite alarm and not quite anger, but something that combined elements of both. She tied her horse at the post with less care than she usually gave it, which told him more than her expression did. "What happened?" he asked. "The deed registry office in Santa Fe has been closed for routine audit," she said. "Effective yesterday. All access to territorial deed records suspended for 2 weeks." She set her satchel on the table with a controlled motion that barely concealed its forceful intention. which means I cannot obtain the certified copies I need from the registry to present as evidence at the hearing." Aaron felt the cold feeling return to his chest. "Fitch arranged it," he said. "He has connections in the territorial administration. Someone notified him that an audit was in progress, and he found a way to create this obstacle." She opened her satchel and began laying documents on the table with methodical precision. But he made an assumption. He assumed the only copies of the relevant records were in the Santa Fe office. Aaron watched her. "Were they?" She looked up, and there was something in her eyes that he had not seen before, a kind of fierce, contained satisfaction that was simultaneously professional and personal. "I have been conducting land audits in this territory for 3 years," she said. "I created working copies of every document I accessed in that registry, every plat, every original deed filing, every boundary survey, annotated and cross-referenced." She touched a thick leather folder. "And 6 months ago, because I suspected that Fitch had enough influence to compromise the official records, I had a second set of certified copies made and sealed by a notary in Albuquerque, with an independent verification chain that does not run through the Santa Fe office." She opened the leather folder and spread it across the table, and Aaron stared at the neat, precise documents within it, each one bearing an official wax seal and the notary's stamp, each one annotated in Delia's distinctive handwriting. "You knew they would try to block you," he said. "I have been building a case against Garrett Fitch for 3 years," she said. "I assumed he would try to block me. I planned accordingly." Aaron looked at the documents, then at her. He was not a man who was easily surprised. He had grown up on this land and learned early that the world was capable of anything, beauty or cruelty, with equal indifference, and he had developed a kind of steady equilibrium in the face of both. But in that moment, looking at what she had built, the sheer magnitude of the preparation, the foresight, the relentless, methodical intelligence behind it, he felt something that he could only describe afterward as a kind of awe. It swept through him with the force of a weather change, sudden and total. He realized in that moment that he was completely and irreversibly in love with her. It was not a comfortable realization. She was focused entirely on a professional mission. She had given him no indication that she thought of him as anything other than the subject of her audit, a sympathetic subject certainly, a man whose situation she was determined to remedy, but not someone she had thought about the way he had been thinking about her. And even if she had, there was the matter of the audit itself, the professional relationship that would make any personal declaration something uncomfortably close to an abuse of the situation. So he said nothing. He helped her organize the documents. He made more coffee. He said, "What do we do next?" What they did next was prepare for the hearing. In the days leading up to the 14th, Delia organized her evidence into a presentation that Aaron privately thought was the most impressive piece of work he had ever seen in a professional context. It was not merely the documents, though they were damning enough. It was the narrative she built from them, layer by layer, that took the raw survey mathematics and translated it into something even a non-technical audience could understand. She drew maps. Clear, precise, beautifully executed maps that showed exactly where Fitch's company had manipulated boundary lines, overlaying the original grants with the fraudulent amendments in a way that made the deception visually undeniable. She annotated each piece of evidence with the specific provision of territorial law it violated. She prepared a timeline of the company's operations in the valley that showed the pattern of predation so clearly it was almost elegant in its horrible logic. She worked with a focused energy that had a kind of beauty in it, the beauty of someone who has been waiting a long time to do the thing they were made for. Aaron had never been around anyone who was quite so thoroughly in their element, and watching her was like watching a river moving with the full force of its gradient, unstoppable and perfectly suited to its course. On the evening of the 13th, the night before the hearing, she finally stopped working and sat back in her chair and rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands, and in that gesture of exhaustion she looked, for the first time, entirely human and unguarded. "You should eat something," Aaron said. He had kept a plate warm on the stove. "I know," she said, and let him put the plate in front of her without arguing, which was unusual enough that it caught his attention. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The fire had burned down to coals and the kitchen was warm and golden, and outside the night was vast and quiet over the valley. Aaron looked at the map she had drawn, spread across the end of the table, and thought about his father filing the original deed in a government office 18 years ago, and about the specific, stubborn love of land that had brought his family to this valley, and about the fact that tomorrow a woman he had known for 2 weeks was going to walk into that town hall and fight for it with everything she had. "Delia," he said. She looked up. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I need you to know that what you have done here, what you have built, this case, this work, it is the most remarkable thing I have ever seen a person do. Not a woman, a person." He paused because he was not a man who spoke easily in these registers and he wanted to be accurate. "I am grateful to you. I am also, if you will permit me to say it, enormously impressed. I have never met anyone quite like you." She looked at him for a moment without speaking, and he watched something move behind her eyes that was complicated and real. "Thank you, Aaron," she said. And then, with the careful precision that was characteristic of everything she did, "I need you to know that this case began as a personal mission for me. It was about my father and about justice. But the reason I worked this hard on your specific situation, harder than I needed to for the evidentiary record, is because somewhere in the past 2 weeks it became about something else as well." She did not elaborate, but the way she held his gaze when she said it told him something more than the words did, and he held onto that something like a man holding onto a rope in dark water. "We should sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be a fight." The morning of the 14th was cold, with a high clear sky the color of a faded curtain, and a wind coming down from the mountains that had the first bite of winter in it. Aaron put on his best coat, which was not very fine but was clean and well-maintained, and he rode into Redemption Creek with Delia beside him, both of them quiet in a way that was not tension but something more like shared resolve. The town hall was already filling when they arrived. Word had traveled, the way word always traveled in small western towns, which was with the speed and imprecision of rumor. People knew a foreclosure hearing was scheduled, and they knew it concerned the Bailey Ranch, and a number of them had their own reasons to be interested in the outcome. 3 other ranchers from the valley, men who had their own dealings with the Consolidated Land Company, were present. The blacksmith, a man named Ortega who had known Aaron's father, stood near the back with his arms crossed and a look of grim solidarity on his face. Even Reverend Caldwell had come, though Aaron suspected this was more from human curiosity than pastoral concern. Deputy Marshal Clyde Hurst arrived with 2 men Aaron did not recognize, both of them in suits that did not belong to the territory, city men, with the particular impatience of people who regard the proceedings before them as a formality. Hurst himself was 45, lean and weather-damaged, with a badge that had always seemed to Aaron to sit on his chest like a piece of decorative hardware rather than an emblem of responsibility. Hurst had been Fitch's instrument in the valley for 2 years. He did not own his corruption the way some corrupt men did, with a kind of aggressive defensiveness, but wore it instead like something slightly shameful that he had convinced himself was practical. Aaron had no particular hatred for him. He found him sad. Garrett Fitch was not present. Aaron had not expected him to be. Fitch operated through intermediaries and let other men stand in the exposure. Hurst called the proceeding to order at 9 in the morning and began reading from the document with the particular cadence of a man reciting something he has memorized: the debt, the fraudulent clause, the notice of default, the company's claim to the property. The room listened. Aaron stood at the front with his hat in his hands and felt the eyes on him and kept his face still. And then Delia's voice came from the back of the room like a clean, cold bell. "Stop." She walked to the front through the parting crowd and placed the sealed envelope on the table, and gave her name and her credentials and watched Hurst's face cycle through surprise, irritation, and then a careful blankness that told Aaron the man was working out the implications. "Miss Maddox," Hurst said, "this is a legal proceeding, and a registered land agent does not have the authority to—" "I have the authority of the Territorial Land Office," she said, and produced her commission document with the calm certainty of someone who has rehearsed for precisely this objection. "I am not here to argue the terms of the debt, which is a matter for the courts. I am here to introduce evidence of survey fraud and deed manipulation that materially affects the status of all land transactions conducted by the Consolidated Territorial Land Company in this valley, including the debt transfer that underlies this proceeding. You cannot just introduce evidence at A. The Rules of Territorial Property Proceedings, Section 14, Paragraph 3, authorize a licensed land agent to present documented evidence of deed irregularities in any proceeding that involves a title transfer." She said this from memory, with a precision that brooked no argument. That section was written for exactly this kind of situation. "I suggest someone in this room verify it before making further objections." The room had gone very still. Hurst looked at the two men in suits who looked at each other. "Let her speak," said one of the older ranchers from the back. There was a sound of general agreement. Hurst, with the expression of a man who has stepped onto ice and is testing each inch forward, indicated that she should proceed. What followed was the most impressive 45 minutes Aaron had ever witnessed. Delia spread her maps on the table at the front of the room and walked through the evidence with the clear, unhurried precision of a master teacher who knows her material so thoroughly that she can make the complex simple without losing any of its truth. She showed the original survey grants, the fraudulent amendments, the mathematical proof of the manipulation, and the pattern of boundary shifts that had been systematically applied to 8 properties in the valley. She presented the timeline of the company's operations. She showed the sealed certified copies from Albuquerque, each one verified through a chain of authority that was independent of the Santa Fe office the company had managed to temporarily shut down. She saved Aaron's property for last. She showed his original grant, his father's filed plat from 1864, the marker that had been moved, the fraudulent boundary amendment filed against the neighboring property. And then, with the calm efficiency of a surgeon completing a final suture, she produced the second sealed deed. It was the original filed deed from the Territorial Land Office, certified and notarized, with a chain of title that went unbroken from James Bailey's filing in 1864 to the present day, and it contained the original boundary descriptions in their unaltered form. Placed beside the Consolidated Land Company's fraudulent amendment, the discrepancy was not merely visible but undeniable, a 14-acre theft documented in its own handwriting. "The debt transfer clause that this proceeding is based on," Delia said, turning to address Hurst directly, "is not merely legally questionable. It is part of a systematic pattern of fraud that I am prepared to present to the Territorial Court in its entirety. Any action taken against Mr. Bailey's property under these circumstances would expose the territory of New Mexico to significant legal liability, and any official who facilitates such an action would be personally named in the subsequent proceedings." The silence in the room was the kind that has texture to it. Hurst looked at the documents. He looked at the two men in suits. The men in suits had developed the particular stillness of people who are rapidly recalculating their position. One of them cleared his throat. "Given the presentation of new evidence," he said, "we will require time to consult with our legal counsel before continuing." "Of course," Delia said pleasantly. The proceeding was formally suspended. Outside the town hall in the autumn sunlight, the gathered townspeople erupted in something between argument and celebration, voices layering over each other, ranchers shaking hands and asking questions, Ortega clapping Aaron on the back with a force that nearly knocked him sideways. Aaron stood in the middle of it and looked for Delia. She was standing a little apart from the crowd near the hitching post, her leather satchel closed now and her hands at her sides, looking out at the main street of Redemption Creek with an expression he had not seen before. It took him a moment to name it. She looked, for the first time since he had known her, like someone who has put down a very heavy thing they have been carrying for a very long time. He walked over to her. "You should be pleased," he said. "I am," she said. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears but was in the same emotional neighborhood. "I am very pleased." "That was the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen," he said. She smiled at him, and it was a real smile, not the small controlled one he had seen in the kitchen. This one went all the way to her eyes and transformed her face completely, and Aaron felt it hit him somewhere in the chest with a force entirely disproportionate to the small physical event of a person smiling. "It is not over," she said. "The court proceedings will take months. Fitch will fight everything. He has resources and connections and he will use all of them." "I know," Aaron said, "but you have the truth, and I have the sense that when you are holding the truth, you tend to know what to do with it." She looked at him for a moment with that measuring, careful quality he had come to know. "Aaron," she said, "yes. The thing I said last night, about the work becoming about something else." She paused. She did not often pause. "I meant it, and I think you knew what I meant and you were kind enough not to press it, which is one of many things I respect about you." She took a small breath. "I am not a woman who does things by halves. If this is something real between us, I need you to know that I will be in this territory for months, perhaps longer, while the case proceeds. And I will be entirely myself during that time, which is not always convenient or comfortable." "I noticed that about you," he said. "I know. Delia," he said, "I would not want you to be anyone else." She looked at him for another moment, and then she reached out and put her hand on his arm, briefly but with intention, and the warmth of it went through his coat sleeve like summer through glass. "Then we understand each other," she said. They did. The months that followed were not simple ones, but they were good in the way that difficult, purposeful things are good when you are working through them with someone whose company makes the difficulty worthwhile. The territorial court proceedings began in November. Fitch did indeed fight with everything he had, which turned out to be considerable. He retained a lawyer from Santa Fe, a man named Cleary who had an excellent reputation and an elastic relationship with the truth, and Cleary spent the first month filing motions to suppress Delia's evidence on procedural grounds, challenging her certification, questioning the chain of title on the notarized copies, and generally doing everything in his legal power to delay, confuse, and obstruct. Delia was prepared for all of it. She had spent 3 years preparing for all of it. Aaron sat in the courtroom on the days the proceedings ran and watched her face down every challenge with a steady, methodical competence that left Cleary visibly frustrated. She had an answer for every objection, a document for every challenge, and a command of territorial property law that was so thorough that the judge, an old man named Hartwell who had been on the territorial bench for 15 years, began addressing her with the specific deference he reserved for fellow professionals. The survey evidence was admitted in full. The mathematical proof of the boundary manipulations was admitted. The pattern evidence, the 8 properties, the timeline was admitted. The sealed deed from Albuquerque was admitted and placed on the official record. Fitch's lawyers argued that the debt transfer clause was a standard commercial provision and that the Bailey Ranch matter was entirely separate from the survey fraud. Judge Hartwell looked at the timeline Delia had prepared, which showed the debt transfer and the survey manipulations proceeding simultaneously over an 18-month period, and found the argument unpersuasive. On the 7th of February, 1883, Judge Hartwell issued his ruling. The debt transfer clause was declared fraudulent and void. The boundary amendments filed by the Consolidated Territorial Land Company were declared invalid. The Bailey Ranch's title was confirmed in full with the original boundaries. The company was ordered to pay damages to all 8 Valley property owners whose survey records had been manipulated. Garrett Fitch was named in a separate criminal referral that Hartwell sent to the territorial prosecutor. He was arrested 3 weeks later in Santa Fe, having apparently spent the intervening weeks attempting, unsuccessfully, to arrange a departure from the territory. His connections in the territorial administration proved less durable than he had believed. Several of them had decided, upon seeing the weight of evidence against him, that their continued loyalty to Fitch was a poor investment. The day the ruling came through, Aaron was in the courtroom, and when Judge Hartwell finished reading the last paragraph, Aaron looked at Delia and she looked at him, and something passed between them that had no word exactly, only a warm, solid recognition of something completed. He took her to dinner that evening at the best establishment Redemption Creek offered, which was a restaurant in the hotel run by a woman named Clara Yost who had come from New Orleans and cooked accordingly. They sat across from each other with the legal victory between them like a warm fire, and they talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing with the comfortable expansiveness of two people who have decided, without quite saying so, that they have time. After dinner, they walked along the main street of Redemption Creek in the cold February night, the stars overhead thick and indifferent and beautiful, and Aaron told her that he would like her to stay. Not in the professional capacity, he said. Not as a land agent with ongoing business in the territory, though that was also true. He meant that he would like her to stay because the valley was different when she was in it, and he was different when she was in it, and he had spent enough years alone on that land to know the difference between solitude that was productive and solitude that was simply empty. And since she had come, the house had stopped being empty in a way he had not known to miss until it was filled. She was quiet for a moment, walking beside him with her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Then she said, "I have been offered a permanent post with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, but the work I do does not require a fixed office. It requires access to survey equipment, deed records, and a great deal of open country." She paused. A ranch in the Duskwater Valley would be a reasonable base of operations. He stopped walking and looked at her. "Is that a yes?" he said. She looked up at him with those green eyes that had always seen directly through to whatever they were looking at, and there was something in them that was warmer and less guarded than anything he had seen in her before, a softness she had been protecting carefully and was now, deliberately, allowing him to see. "That is a yes," she said. He kissed her there on the main street of Redemption Creek under the February stars, and it was a first kiss that had the quality of a conclusion, the way the last piece of a complex piece of work fits into place, and suddenly everything you have been building makes the sense it was always going to make. They married in May. It was a small ceremony, which was what they both wanted, held in the yard of the Bailey Ranch on a morning when the valley was in full spring, and the desert was briefly and abundantly green, and the mesas to the west were the color of old copper in the early light. Reverend Caldwell officiated. Ortega and his family came, and the 3 ranchers from the valley who had been part of the court case, and Clara Yost from the restaurant, and Miguel and Pete, Aaron's ranch hands, who had developed an enormous respect for Delia over the months and wore their best shirts in her honor. Delia wore a dress she had made herself, a simple, well-cut thing in a blue-gray that matched the mountains, and she came out of the house and walked across the yard to where Aaron stood with the particular upright, unhurried quality she brought to everything. And when she reached him, she looked up at him with the smile that went all the way to her eyes, the real one, the one that was his. They made their vows with their hands clasped and their voices steady, and the spring wind moving through the old cottonwood at the yard's edge, and Aaron thought about his father filing a deed in a government office 20 years ago with the conviction that this land could be made into something beautiful, and about the specific and unexpected ways that conviction had proved correct. The first year of their marriage had the quality of a revelation. Aaron had expected adjustment. He knew himself well enough to know that he had been a solitary man for a long time, and that solitary men did not always make easy partners, that he had habits of self-sufficiency and a tendency towards silence that could read as distance. And he had known Delia long enough to understand that she was not a woman who would accommodate those tendencies through passive tolerance, but would name them directly, which could be uncomfortable, but which he had come to prefer to the alternative. What he had not expected was how right it would feel. Not the romantic version of right that people described in terms of completion or filling an absence, but the more durable rightness of two people whose particular qualities complement each other in ways that make both of them more fully themselves rather than less. Delia made him articulate. She asked questions that required answers, and in formulating those answers he discovered things about himself he had not previously known. And he, through his patience and his steadiness and his thorough understanding of the land she worked within, made her work better, which was the highest compliment she could have received, and which they both knew it. She continued her work with the Territorial Land Office, taking on survey audits and deed investigations across the territory, sometimes gone for 2 or 3 weeks at a stretch with her transit and her satchel and her dark bay horse. Aaron managed the ranch and the boundary line and the particular calendar of the land, and when she came back, the house received her with the specific warmth of a place that has been holding itself ready. The criminal case against Fitch proceeded through the territorial courts and concluded in September of 1883 with a conviction on 4 counts of fraud and 2 counts of filing false government documents. He was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison in Santa Fe. The connections who had served him so well for so long proved useless to him in the face of Delia's evidence, which was simply too complete and too carefully documented to be dismantled by any amount of influence. He was led from the courtroom in irons, and Delia watched it from the gallery with an expression that Aaron, seated beside her, read accurately as the final closing of a door she had needed very badly to close. She did not cry. She held his hand with a firm, deliberate pressure, and he held hers back, and that was the entirety of what the moment required. She told him that night, back in the hotel room in Santa Fe that they had taken for the duration of the proceedings, about the last time she had seen her father, about how he had been a man with enormous capacities who had been systematically stripped of them, the land, the livelihood, the confidence, and how he had died not dramatically but quietly, defeated by the incremental theft of everything that had made him himself. She told this story in a low, steady voice looking at the ceiling, and Aaron lay beside her and listened with his full attention, and when she was finished he said, "You made it right," and she said, "I made what I could write." And then she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I think he would have liked you," and Aaron said, "I hope so." And they were comfortable with each other in the dark in a way that was its own kind of peace. The second year brought new things. The ranch had been doing well, better than it had in the years before the legal trouble, partly because Aaron had used the winter months to improve the operation's efficiency in ways he had been putting off, and partly because the resolution of the boundary dispute had actually clarified several old water rights questions that had been technically unresolved for years. He hired 2 additional hands and began a modest expansion of the cattle operation that his father had always spoken about wanting to do. Delia took on a consulting role with the territorial government, which was attempting, belatedly and imperfectly, to address the land fraud that had been occurring across the territory for years. The Bailey case had served as a catalyst for wider scrutiny, and there were now formal proceedings in 3 other counties based on evidence she had gathered and additional investigations her work had prompted. She wrote a report for the Territorial Land Commission that outlined a systematic methodology for detecting survey fraud, which was eventually distributed to land offices across the territory and became something of a standard reference document. She was 29, then 30, and she carried both ages with the same quality she carried everything, with a kind of vigorous intelligence that made her seem simultaneously timeless and entirely of her moment. In the early autumn of 1884, She told Aaron she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, which was where most of their important conversations happened, sitting across the table from him in the morning with her coffee, in the same direct way she told him everything. She watched his face, alert to his reaction with the characteristic Delia Maddox quality of wanting accurate information rather than performed emotion. What she saw on his face was something he did not try to moderate or present. It was simply joy, uncomplicated and total, the kind that comes from a long sequence of difficult, worthwhile things having built toward a moment of complete rightness. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling entirely well," she said, slightly less interested in coffee than usual but otherwise entirely well. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she allowed it with the small smile that he knew by now was not small at all. Their son was born in April of 1885, on a morning when the valley was in the first green of its second spring, and the cottonwood outside the yard was just beginning to come into leaf. He was a healthy, vocal child with dark hair like his father and eyes that were already showing signs of the green they would settle into. They named him James, for Aaron's father, and the name felt right in the way that the best names do, not as a tribute to the past, but as a continuation of something living. Delia was not a woman who found early motherhood simple or instinctive, and she did not pretend that she did. She was thoughtful about it the way she was thoughtful about everything, approaching each new aspect of it with practical attention and the willingness to learn, which turned out to be exactly what was needed. She nursed James and held him and learned his particular language of need with the same focused attention she brought to a survey record. And by the time he was 3 months old, she had achieved a competence in his care that was entirely her own and made no apologies for the path she had taken to it. She was also, within 6 months, back at work. She took James with her when the work allowed it, in a carrier across her chest, or in the panniers of the pack mule, adapted with characteristic ingenuity to serve as a portable cradle. The image of Delia Maddox setting up her surveyor's transit on a mesa top with her infant son sleeping, strapped to her back, became something of a landmark site in certain parts of the New Mexico territory, and was discussed in tones that mixed admiration and bemusement in equal measure among people who had not quite encountered her particular approach to life before. Aaron went with her when he could, which was more often than the ranch would once have permitted, because of the additional hands and the improved efficiency of the operation. He had also, quietly and without making a production of it, developed a genuine facility with the baby, which did not surprise anyone who knew him well. He was a patient man, thorough and attentive, and those qualities translated with perfect naturalness into fatherhood. In the summer of 1886, Deputy Marshal Clyde Hurst came to the ranch. He came alone and without ceremony, on a weekday morning when Aaron was working with the horses and Delia was inside with James, who had just turned 1 and was developing strong opinions about the world. Hurst tied his horse at the gate and stood there for a moment before calling out, which was a form of consideration he had not previously demonstrated. Aaron walked over and stood on his side of the gate and looked at Hurst, who looked back at him with something in his face that was recognizable as the expression of a man who has thought carefully about something and decided to do the harder thing. "I came to apologize," Hurst said. "Not to make it right, because I do not think that is in my power, but to say it plainly." He met Aaron's eyes with an effort that was visible. "What I did, facilitating Fitch's operations in this valley, what I was part of, it was wrong. I knew it was wrong, and I told myself enough things to keep from fully facing it, and I have spent the past 3 years not quite able to stop facing it." He paused. "Your wife's testimony to the court included evidence of what I helped cover up, and the fact that she presented it the way she did, without malice, just as fact, has stayed with me. I owe you both a great deal more than an apology, but this is what I have to offer." Aaron was quiet for a moment. He thought about his father. He thought about the cold morning in October when the gavel had come down. He thought about the way Delia had described the specific cruelty of having things taken from you not by force but by paperwork. "I accept it," he said, "and I appreciate you coming here to say it." Hurst nodded. He looked relieved in the way of a man who has been expecting to be refused and is grateful for the grace. He was no longer deputy marshal, Aaron knew. He had resigned the position 6 months after the Fitch proceedings concluded. Delia had come out onto the porch at some point during the exchange, holding James on her hip with one arm, and when Aaron turned to look at her she met his eyes and gave a small nod that said she had heard and that she considered the matter appropriately handled. Hurst rode away down the south road and Aaron watched him go. "You are a generous man," Delia said from the porch. "He told the truth when he did not have to," Aaron said. "That deserves something." She looked at him across the yard with James on her hip, the morning light full on both of them, and Aaron thought that if he lived to be 90 he would carry this image with perfect clarity. The ranch yard in summer, the mesas red against the morning blue, and Delia standing there with their son, and that particular expression that was still, even now, capable of catching him completely off guard with the force of what it meant to him. He walked back across the yard and kissed her, which made James extremely curious and resulted in a small hand being applied firmly to Aaron's face, which made both of them laugh. The third child came in the spring of 1889. Before that, in 1887, they had welcomed a daughter they named Clara, for Clara Yost, who had been kind to them both in the early days, and she arrived with red hair that belonged to neither of her parents and a temperament of formidable determination that did. James, by then 4 years old and a serious, observant child who had his mother's eyes and his father's steady patience, accepted the arrival of a sister with the philosophical equanimity of a small person who has been adequately prepared for the event. The ranch had grown by then into something that Aaron's father would have recognized as the fulfillment of the original vision. 412 acres, clean and properly surveyed and legally secured, with a cattle operation that supported 6 full-time workers and their families, a functioning well system that Delia had helped design based on principles of hydrology she had picked up from her surveying work, and an orchard along the eastern slope that was in its 5th year and beginning to produce with real abundance. The house had grown too, expanded over 3 winters into something that could hold a family of 5 with room for guests, with a study for Delia where her books and instruments and papers could exist in the organized complexity they required without invading the kitchen table, and a workshop for Aaron where the mechanical work of the ranch did not need to come indoors. They had neighbors they liked and respected, other valley families whose lands had been secured through the court proceedings, and an informal network of mutual support that was the specific and undervalued wealth of frontier life conducted with integrity. Ortega and his family came for Sunday dinners periodically, and the talk around the table was good. Delia's work had evolved by then from active field surveying into a combination of consulting, expert testimony, and the training of other land agents, both men and the occasional woman, in the methodology she had developed. She had been approached twice about positions in Washington, where the General Land Office was attempting to reform its operations in response to the widespread fraud that had been documented across the territories. Both times she had declined because the ranch and the valley and the specific and unrepeatable life she had built there were not things she was willing to leave. She said this to Aaron once, when he asked her directly whether he was the reason she had declined the second offer, which had been a significant professional advancement. "You are part of the reason," she said, with characteristic precision. "James and Clara and the one coming are part of the reason. The valley is part of the reason. My work here is part of the reason." She paused and then added, "But also, I have never believed in Washington's ability to accomplish what determined people can accomplish directly, in the actual places where the land is." He accepted this answer with the completeness it deserved. The third child, born in April of 1889, was a son they named Thomas. He arrived with his father's coloring, and what appeared to be his mother's appetite for information, manifesting at 4 months in an intense interest in every object within reach, and a disgruntlement with any limitation on that investigation. James, 6 years old and patient in a way that made people smile, appointed himself Thomas's unofficial guardian with a seriousness that Aaron found deeply moving. Clara, 2 years old and in the grip of a fully independent spirit, was more ambivalent about the addition, but adjusted with the pragmatism of a child who has learned that the world is not shaped by her preferences. Aaron was 38 years old when Thomas was born, and Delia was 35, and they were people who had built something from the specific materials of their particular natures and the specific circumstances they had found themselves in. And what they had built was not simple or without its difficulties, but it was genuinely, durably good. On the evening of Thomas's first birthday, April 1890, they sat on the porch of the Bailey Ranch house as the sun went down behind the mesas and turned the sky the colors that the New Mexico desert reserved for itself alone, deep rose and amber, and a blue that was simultaneously warm and infinite. Thomas was asleep against Aaron's chest, having exhausted himself on the business of his first birthday. James sat on the step below them with a book, reading with the focused absorption that was entirely his mother's. Clara was somewhere in the yard, conducting an expedition whose purpose was not entirely clear, but which seemed to involve serious examination of the ground near the old cottonwood. Delia sat beside Aaron with her shoulder against his arm and her coffee in her hands and her eyes on the western sky, and the expression she wore was one he had not seen on her when they first met, or for a long time after. It was the expression of a person who is fully at rest in the place they are, not temporarily between occupations but genuinely, completely at home. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, which with Delia meant she was formulating an accurate answer rather than an immediate one. "I am thinking about the morning I rode up that south road," she said. "I had my case and my instruments and my 3-year-old mission, and I had already built walls around everything that was not the work, and I was entirely certain that was the correct arrangement." She took a sip of coffee. "And then you answered the gate, and you had your hat in your hand, and you looked at my official papers with the expression of a man who was trying very hard not to let himself hope, and I thought, there is a person who understands something important about what it costs to care about a thing." She paused. "I did not acknowledge what I thought at the time. It would have been professionally inconvenient." "I know," he said. "But I thought it," she said. Thomas stirred slightly against his chest and resettled. Aaron's arm tightened automatically, and the child subsided back into the profound sleep of the deeply satisfied. "I thought something too," Aaron said. "That first evening when you spread the map on the kitchen table and started asking me questions. I thought, this woman knows things I do not know, and she is not apologizing for that, and that is the most interesting thing I have come across in years." "You were intimidated," she said with a trace of amusement. "Briefly," he said, "and then I was impressed, and then I was gone." She looked up at him with the smile that went all the way to her eyes. "Gone," she repeated. "Completely," he said. Clara appeared at the edge of the yard, holding something she had discovered near the cottonwood, a smooth stone of interesting color, which she brought to her mother with the gravity of a person presenting a significant find. Delia received it with the appropriate seriousness and examined it with genuine attention, because she had never in her professional life looked at a stone without examining it, and Clara watched this examination with satisfied approval and then ran back to continue her investigation. James looked up from his book, observed his sister's departure, and returned to the book. The sun finished its descent. The sky moved through its colors and into the deep transparent blue of high desert evening, and the first stars appeared, large and low and familiar. This was the land that James Bailey had filed for in 1864 with a mule and a conviction. This was the land that Garrett Fitch had tried to take with documents and connections, and the particular cruelty of men who mistake the ability to take things for the right to take them. This was the land that a woman with a surveyor's transit and a leather satchel full of sealed documents had ridden into from the South Road on a particular autumn morning and saved, not only from a fraudulent foreclosure, but from the specific despair that comes when the things built with love and labor are taken by men who do not deserve them. This was the Bailey Ranch, 412 acres of Duskwater Valley, clean and properly surveyed and legally secured, with a family on its porch watching the evening come in, and a stone of interesting color now sitting on the railing as a record of the day's discoveries. It was, Aaron thought, exactly what his father had been trying to build. And it was more, because of the woman beside him who had made it both saved and shared, who had brought to it everything she was, the fierce intelligence, the methodical courage, the capacity for love that she had protected carefully for a long time and had finally, deliberately, allowed to grow in the specific soil of this place and this life and this man. He put his free arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the settled, real weight of a person who is exactly where they have chosen to be. Thomas slept, James turned a page, Clara found another stone. And the valley held all of it, the way it had always held what was given to it with honesty and care, the way land does when the people on it understand that they do not own the place but are simply, for their allotted time, the ones entrusted with keeping it worth passing on.